I never thought the day would come when my own son would look at me with eyes that carried no warmth. I raised him with love. I gave him everything. I had every dream, every heartbeat, every sacrifice was for him. I built a home so he would never feel the cold of the world, but somewhere along the way he forgot what love looked like. He grew up surrounded by comfort, expensive things, soft beds, and bright lights. But maybe all that comfort blinded him to the meaning of care. I remember the mornings when he would run to me with open arms, calling me his world back then. I thought that bond would never break, but life has strange ways of testing faith. It started slowly, a few missed calls, a few months without visits, then one day he appeared at my door wearing a perfect smile that hid something dark behind it. He hugged me, but the warmth was gone. It felt like he was acting, like he was following a script. I asked him if everything was fine, and he said everything was perfect, that he just missed his mother. Yet, as he sat down, his eyes kept glancing around the house, as if searching for something. My heart grew uneasy. I did not know then that greed had already replaced love in his heart. The house that once echoed with his laughter now felt heavy with silence. His wife was with him. She was beautiful, confident, and cold. Her words were soft, but her eyes were sharp. I could tell she had practiced every smile before walking in that day. They both spoke sweetly about life and work, about how busy they had been, but I could feel it in my bones that this was not a visit of love, it was a visit of purpose. When I asked how they were managing financially, she sighed and said times were tough, but they were strong together. My son nodded, agreeing like a loyal shadow. My motherly instinct wanted to help, but something inside told me to wait. The air between us grew thicker with every passing minute, and when she finally mentioned the inheritance, the real reason for their visit became clear. My chest tightened as I listened, pretending not to notice her words shaping traps. She said, I must start thinking about the future, about who will handle my estate, about who will take care of the money when I am gone. My son sat silently, eyes on the floor, not once looking at me. I smiled gently, hiding my heartbreak. I asked her why she thought I would be gone soon, and she laughed nervously, saying she just wanted me to have peace of mind. I looked at my son, waiting for him to say something to stop her, to remind her that love should not be about money, but he said nothing. That silence was the loudest sound I had ever heard. That night after they left, I sat alone in my quiet living room. The ticking clock was the only sound that kept me company. I stared at the door, hoping it would open again, hoping my son would come back and say he was sorry, that he did not mean any of it, but the door stayed closed. The silence felt heavy, like it wanted to crush me. My heart kept whispering, maybe I misunderstood, maybe it was just her idea, not his, but deep down I knew it was both of them. I could see it in his eyes, the same eyes that once looked at me with love, now looked at me with calculation. The next few days he called. Often he sounded caring, asking about my health, about my routine, and every call ended with his wife joining in with soft, sweet words, reminding me that I was getting old, that I should not be alone in a big house, that I should let them take care of everything. I wanted to believe that maybe they cared, maybe they just wanted to help, but when she started sending property papers and forms for me to sign, I knew it was not love anymore, it was business. They said it was just formality, just in case something happened to me. I listened quietly, my hands trembling. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask, how could you do this to me? but the words stayed inside my throat. My nights became sleepless. Every shadow reminded me of betrayal. I could not eat, I could not rest. My memories of his childhood started to haunt me. The times I carried him to school, the times I stayed up all night when he was sick, the birthdays I celebrated alone because his father had left us. All those moments now felt like foolish dreams. I had sacrificed everything to raise him alone, working day and night to build what we had, and now all he saw in me was a key to money. One morning he came again, this time without calling. His wife walked in first, holding her phone recording something. I asked her why she was filming, and she said she just liked to capture moments, but her tone made me uneasy. My son looked at me differently, this time confident, like he had already won. He sat across from me and said, "Mother, it is time you start thinking clearly. You are not young anymore. You cannot handle everything alone." I said I was fine. I told him I could still manage, but he smiled and said, "We can make it easier for you. If you sign the papers, you can rest. We will handle the business. You can live peacefully here without any worry." I looked at his wife and she nodded, smiling like a snake. She said she would take care of me like her own mother. Those words burned inside me because I knew they were lies. I stood up slowly, looked at my son, and said, "I have spent my life fighting for you. I will not sign my life away." He frowned, his voice turned cold, and he said, "Listen, old woman, leave your 25 million to my wife, or stay alone." My legs felt weak. I almost fell. The room spun, but I did not cry. I just stared at him and said, "Then I will stay alone." After that day, everything changed. The house that once felt alive now felt like a grave. I stopped hearing from him for weeks, and when I did, the calls were cold, short, and filled with fake politeness. His wife never spoke again, and I knew they had decided to wait for me to break. They thought loneliness would make me weak, that time would make me surrender, but they forgot I had lived a lifetime of struggle. Before they were even born, I started noticing strange things. The maid who had worked for me for years suddenly left without notice. The accountant stopped answering my messages, and even the gardener who had always smiled kindly at me avoided my eyes. Something inside told me they were being paid to stay away. It was their way of pushing me into silence. One night, I overheard two voices outside my gate. It was my son and his wife. They did not know I was near. I heard her say, "She will give up soon. She is old. She cannot fight this forever." He said, "I know her. She will try to resist, but once she falls sick, we will have everything." I wanted to scream, but I held my breath, letting the darkness hide me. When they drove away, I went back inside. Trembling, I sat in my chair and whispered to myself, "They think I am weak, but they will soon see what I can do." I spent the next few days in quiet thought. I went through every document, every file, every account. I had built this empire from scratch, and I knew every piece of it. I realized that most of my holdings were still under my full control. They thought I was careless, but I had been cautious all my life. I started making calls, not to family, not to friends, but to old trusted people who owed me loyalty. A lawyer who once worked for me when he was young, a manager who had always admired my honesty, and an old friend who had moved abroad but still cared for me. I told them everything, and they agreed to help quietly without letting my son know. Within days, I moved a large part of my funds into a private trust, something my son could never touch. I also started recording my conversations with him. I wanted the truth, to have proof. The next time he came, he would not see a broken old woman, he would see someone who had already decided to fight back. A week later, he called again, pretending to check on me. I could hear his wife whispering in the background, telling him what to say. I answered calmly, told him I was fine, and even asked him to come visit again. He sounded surprised, maybe even happy that I had softened, but I smiled to myself because he had no idea that I was no longer his victim. I was now the storm he never expected. The next morning, I woke early and looked at the sun rising over the city, the same city that had seen my struggles, my victories, and now my heartbreak. I brewed my tea slowly, my hands still steady, and my mind clear. I knew what I had to do. I had spent my life loving my son, but now I had to protect what was left of me. I called him and told him I wanted to meet him for dinner. I said I had thought about everything, and maybe he was right. Maybe I was being stubborn. He sounded relieved. I could hear the excitement in his voice, as if he had finally broken me. He agreed to come with his wife that evening. I smiled quietly and whispered to myself, let the show begin. I called my lawyer before leaving the house and told him to be ready. I told him to record everything from the next room where I would meet them. We chose a private restaurant, one that had small hidden cameras for security. I knew the owner well, and he agreed to help when I arrived. I wore my favorite blue dress, the one my son used to say made me look strong and proud. When they entered the restaurant, his wife looked surprised to see me dressed so confidently. My son hugged me, pretending to be emotional, but I could feel his coldness under that fake warmth. I said we should eat first and talk later, so we ordered dinner, though none of us truly cared for the food. When the plates were cleared, I took a deep breath and said, I have made a decision about my wealth. His eyes lit up and he leaned forward eagerly. His wife smiled, pretending to be patient. I said, I have decided to divide it all, but not the way you expect. He frowned, confused. I continued, half of it will go into a foundation under my name to help women who are abandoned and betrayed. The other half will go to someone who truly deserves it. My old friend and business partner who stood by me when no one else did. His wife interrupted, saying, that is not fair. You are punishing us for nothing. I looked at her and said, you punished yourself by forgetting what love means. She stood up angry and said, you are doing this because you hate me. I said, no, I am doing this because I love myself. My son sat there speechless, his hands trembling, his face pale. He said, you cannot do this. I said, watch me. He raised his voice and said, you owe me. I gave you everything you have. I laughed softly and said, you gave me pain, and that is all you will ever give me. Then I stood up and walked away, leaving them frozen in silence. My lawyer came out moments later and confirmed that everything was recorded. Their greed, their threats, every word they spoke would stay as proof of what they truly were. When I reached home, I felt lighter for the first time in years. I knew they would not stop, but I also knew I had already taken away their power. Days passed after that dinner, and I felt both peace and fear at the same time. Peace because I had stood up for myself, fear because I knew they would not accept defeat quietly. I could feel the storm coming. I started receiving strange calls at night. Sometimes no one spoke, other times I heard faint breathing. Once I even heard her voice saying, you will regret this, old woman. I did not reply. I simply turned off the phone and prayed for strength, but deep down, I knew they were planning something bigger. A week later, I received a notice from the bank saying there had been an attempt to access one of my accounts. I immediately called my lawyer and he confirmed that someone had tried to use forged papers. It was my son's signature on the request. I felt my hands shake, not from fear, but from disbelief that he would stoop so low. I told my lawyer to stay quiet and gather every detail. I wanted to see how far they would go in their hunger for money. 2 days later, my son came to see me again, this time alone. He looked tired, angry, and desperate. He said, "Mother, what have you done? Everyone in the family is talking about this. You made me look like a fool." I looked at him calmly and said, "The truth makes fools of those who lie." He clenched his fists and said, "You will destroy this family." I said, "No, you destroyed it when you chose greed over love." He stood up and shouted, "You think you are smart, but you are old. You cannot win this." I smiled and said, "Maybe, but I can still expose you." He froze for a moment and said, "What do you mean?" I told him everything had been recorded, his threats, his wife's manipulation, every cruel word. They had said. He went pale, then turned and stormed out. I knew then that he was scared not of losing money, but of losing reputation, because reputation was his last mask. The next morning, I called a journalist, someone who had once interviewed me for my business success years ago. I told her I wanted to share a story, not of wealth, but of betrayal. She agreed to meet privately. I gave her the recordings, the documents, and the proof of forged signatures. I told her not to use our names, but to tell the story of how greed destroys families. Within a week, the story went public. It spread quickly. People began to whisper and point. My son lost his position in his company. His wife stopped being invited to social events. They became the talk of the city, and suddenly their empire started crumbling. I watched from my window as everything they had built on lies began to fall. I did not celebrate. I did not smile. I just sat quietly, letting justice speak for itself. Sometimes the loudest revenge is silence. It was a quiet morning when I decided to see him one last time. I wanted to end it with words, not anger. I wanted him to understand what he had lost, not just the money, but me. I called him and said, "We need to talk." He hesitated, then agreed to meet at the house where he had grown up, the same house that once echoed with his laughter. I sat in the living room waiting. When he arrived, he looked different, thinner, weaker. His pride was gone, his eyes tired. He sat down across from me, and for the first time in years he could not look straight into my eyes. I asked him how he was doing. He said nothing, just stared at the floor. I told him I knew what had happened, that he had lost the company and most of his friends had turned their backs on him. He nodded slowly, then whispered, "Why did you do this to me, Mother?" I looked at him and said, "I did not do this to you. You did this to yourself. I warned you. I begged you to remember love, but you chose greed. You chose to see me as a wallet, not as your mother." He looked up, his eyes wet, and he said, "I made a mistake. I was lost. She made me believe we needed more." I told him, "No one can make you betray the one who gave you life unless you already let greed in your heart." He covered his face with his hands and said, "I am sorry." I said, "I do not want your apology. I want you to learn. I do not hate you, but I can never trust you again." He nodded quietly, then said, "What will you do now?" I said, "I will live. I will use my days to help others, to make sure no mother feels the pain I felt." He looked down and said, "Will you forgive me someday?" I said, "Maybe when you forgive yourself." He stood up slowly and said, "I have lost everything." I said, "No, you still have your chance to change. That is something money cannot buy." He turned and walked Away without another word, as the door closed behind him, I felt a strange calmness in my heart. It was not happiness, it was peace. I looked around the room and whispered to myself, I have nothing to prove anymore. I have survived the worst, and I am. Still standing that night, I wrote a letter to the foundation transferring my remaining shares to the cause of helping women who had been used and abandoned. I told them to build homes to give them strength to never feel alone. I knew that was how my story would end, not with revenge that destroys, but with justice that heals. When I went to bed, I looked at the stars and smiled softly. My journey had been painful, but it taught me one truth: love without respect becomes a weapon, and when family turns that weapon against you, the best revenge is to rise without them. Time moved on like a slow, gentle wave, carrying away the noise of the past and leaving behind quiet, understanding people. Still whispered about my son and his wife. Some said I had gone too far. Others said I was brave, but I stopped caring for opinions because the truth had already spoken through actions, not words. I spent my mornings tending to my garden, planting flowers that reminded me of peace. The air around me began to feel lighter, as if the house itself had forgiven the pain it had seen. Sometimes I would hear children playing in the street, and it would make me smile. It reminded me of the days when my son was young and innocent before money poisoned his heart. I miss that version of him, the boy who once held my hand and promised never to leave me. Sometimes I wished I could go back and hold him again, tell him stories of kindness, tell him that love is worth more than any fortune. But life does not move backward, it only teaches through scars. One afternoon, I received a letter. It was from him. He wrote that he had left the city, moved to a small town, and was working again, starting from nothing. He said he wanted to become the man I once believed he could be. I read it slowly, my eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of relief. Maybe, just maybe, he had finally learned what I had been trying to teach all along. I wrote back wishing him strength and peace. I told him that forgiveness was not a gift I gave, it was something he had to earn through change. As I sealed the letter, I realized my revenge was never about destroying him. It was about making him face himself. I had not ruined him. I had saved him from his own greed by letting him fall. Sometimes letting someone fall is the only way they learn to stand on their own again. That night, I sat by the window and watched the rain. The sound was soft and steady, washing away the dust of old memories. I whispered to myself, justice is not always loud. It is often quiet, steady, and patient. It waits for the right moment to reveal its truth. Years have passed since that day when my son demanded my wealth and called me an old woman. Now, when I look back, I do not feel pain. I feel gratitude. Life showed me faces of love and betrayal, but it also showed me strength I never knew I had. People often think that revenge means hurting someone back, but real revenge is walking away with peace and letting truth do the talking. I built a new life filled with calm mornings, honest laughter, and the company of people who see my heart, not my money. The foundation grew bigger, helping women who once cried in silence. Now they stand tall with hope in their eyes, and when I see them smile, I feel alive again. Sometimes when I walk through the garden, I can almost hear my younger self whispering, thank you for not giving up. The flowers bloom brighter now, maybe because they know this house no longer carries sadness. I heard from my son again 1 year later. He sent me a picture of his small shop and a note that said, I am trying to live with honesty. I hope one day you will visit. I smiled at the picture, placed it on my table, and said, quietly, I already have visited in my prayers. Forgiveness had already found him long before he knew it. That night I sat by the fire, feeling the warmth on my skin. I thought of everything, the lies, the manipulation, the heartbreak, and the revenge, and I realized all of it had one lesson. If you let greed guide your heart, you lose yourself, but if you let truth lead your steps, you always find peace. I closed my eyes and whispered into the still air, listen, old woman, you have survived. You have won, not by fighting, but by standing firm, not by destroying, but by letting life show its justice. When the world takes love and turns it into betrayal, stand tall. When family turns cold, let your silence speak louder than their greed. And when the time comes, remember that strength is not in what you hold, but in what you let go.